Peter Coleman stood in front of his new home on the edge of Ravens Wood in Asheville, North Carolina, taking a deep breath of the fresh mountain air. His black cat, Felix, rubbed against his legs, purring softly. This place was to be their new beginning, an escape from the painful past that had haunted Peter in Charlotte. The house was old, with wooden walls weathered by time and frosted windows that seemed to hide the secrets of years gone by. But for Peter, it was perfect, isolated, quiet, surrounded by majestic trees that whispered soothingly in the wind. "Well, Felix," he said quietly to the cat, "this is our home now. Here we'll find the peace we're looking for." The first few days in the new house passed peacefully. Peter busied himself with minor repairs, walked through the forest with Felix by his side, enjoying the silence and tranquility he so desperately needed. In the evenings, he would sit on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees as the forest shadows lengthened, creating fantastic shapes. However, the peace didn't last long. One afternoon, as Peter was working in the garden, he noticed Felix behaving strangely. The cat sat motionless in front of an old twisted tree at the edge of their property, staring at it intensely and meowing quietly but continuously. "Felix, what's going on, little one?" Peter approached the cat, but it didn't even flinch, still focused on the tree. At first, Peter ignored this behavior, thinking it was just a cat being a cat, but when the situation repeated day after day at the same time, he began to worry. Felix, usually calm and indifferent, now seemed to be obsessed with something Peter couldn't see or understand. On the fifth day, intrigued and concerned, Peter decided to take a closer look at the tree. As he approached, he felt a strange sensation, as if the air around the tree was thicker, heavier. He touched the rough bark and, to his surprise, noticed that a part of the trunk seemed loose. With a pounding heart, he peeled off a piece of bark, revealing a small cavity. Inside was an old leather bag, covered in cobwebs and dirt. Peter hesitated, but curiosity won out. He opened the bag and found several old black and white photographs, an antique pocket watch, and a few old-fashioned ornaments. The photos caught his attention. They all depicted a young woman with a sad, distant look. Peter felt a pang in his heart as he looked at her melancholic face. Who was she? Why were her belongings hidden in this tree? One photo particularly troubled him. The woman was standing next to the very tree where he had found the bag. Peter felt a shiver run down his spine. This couldn't be a coincidence. That night, Peter couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, while Felix restlessly wandered around the house, meowing occasionally. Peter felt that he had discovered something that should have remained hidden. He couldn't ignore it. In the morning, he made a decision. He called his old friend Jack Lawrenson, a private detective from Charlotte. Jack had always been skeptical, but when he heard about Peter's find, he agreed to come. "I've heard various strange stories about this forest," Jack said as they drove to Peter's house, "but never anything about trees hiding secrets." When they arrived, Jack thoroughly examined the tree and the found objects. "This is interesting," he muttered, looking at the photos of the young woman. "I think we need to find out more about who she was." Peter felt a mixture of fear and excitement wash over him. He knew he was entering unknown territory, but he couldn't back out now. The mystery of the tree and the missing woman had completely consumed him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows on the forest, Peter and Jack sat on the porch, planning their next steps in the investigation. Felix sat at their feet, staring intently into the forest, as if he knew something was coming, something that could change their lives forever. The next day, Peter and Jack decided to visit the local archivist. The old archive building smelled of dust and old paper, and the shelves groaned under the weight of books and documents. The archivist, an older man named Walter Novak, greeted them with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "What brings you gentlemen to our little archive?" he asked, adjusting his glasses on his nose. Jack pulled out one of the photos found in the tree. "We're looking for information about this woman and the house on the edge of Ravenswood." Walter took the photo in his hand and stared at it in silence for a long moment. His face paled. "Where did you get this photo?" he asked quietly. Peter and Jack exchanged glances. "We found it, under unusual circumstances," Peter answered cautiously. "Do you recognize her?" Walter sighed heavily. "That's Anna Winters. She disappeared over 30 years ago. It was a great tragedy for our town." The archivist walked to one of the shelves and pulled out a thick folder. "These are the files of Anna's case. She was never found. Some said she ran away, others... well, there were various rumors." Peter felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of rumors?" Walter hesitated. "You see, gentlemen, Ravenswood has a reputation. For years, there have been stories about strange phenomena, about shadows moving between the trees, about whispers on the wind. Some claim that Anna fell victim to something unnatural." Jack snorted in disbelief, but Peter felt his heart racing. He remembered Felix's strange behavior and the heavy atmosphere around the tree. "Were there other disappearances?" Jack asked, flipping through the files. Walter nodded. "Unfortunately, yes. Over the past decades, several young women have disappeared, all near the forest. None of the cases were solved." Peter felt a wave of fear grip his throat. What was hiding in the forest? And why did Felix seem to sense it? On the way back home, Peter and Jack discussed what they had learned. "It must be a coincidence," Jack insisted. "There's nothing supernatural about these disappearances." But Peter wasn't so sure. Something deep inside told him that he had touched something that was beyond human understanding. When they arrived at the house, they found Felix sitting in front of the tree, meowing loudly and continuously. The cat seemed to be in a state of extreme agitation, its eyes wide open and its tail nervously hitting the ground. "Felix, what's going on?" Peter approached the cat, but it didn't even flinch. Suddenly, the wind picked up, and the tree branches began to move violently. Peter felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. For a split second, he thought he saw a female figure between the trees, a figure eerily similar to Anna Winters from the photo. "Jack, did you see that?" he shouted, but when he turned around, the figure was gone. Jack looked at him in surprise. "What was I supposed to see?" Peter shook his head, not sure if what he had seen was reality or just a figment of his imagination. "Nothing. I think I'm seeing things." But Felix kept meowing, staring into the forest as if he could see something that humans couldn't. That night, Peter had nightmares. He dreamed he was wandering through a dark forest, hearing whispers and seeing shadows moving at the edge of his field of vision. In the distance, he saw Anna's figure seeming to call to him, but the more he tried to approach her, the further away she moved. He woke up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding like a hammer. Felix was sitting on his chest, staring at him intensely with his green eyes. "What do you know, Felix?" Peter whispered, stroking the cat. "What do you see that I can't?" The next morning, Peter and Jack decided to search the forest. Armed with flashlights and maps, they ventured into the dense trees. The forest seemed alive, full of whispers and movements they couldn't quite grasp. After several hours of fruitless searching, they came across a small, forgotten cabin hidden deep in the woods. It was old and dilapidated, but something about it caught Peter's attention. "Do you think this has anything to do with Anna?" Jack asked, as they cautiously approached the cabin. Peter felt his heart racing. "I don't know, but I have a feeling we'll find answers here." When they reached the cabin door, Peter hesitated. He felt he was on the threshold of something big, something that could change his life forever. With a deep breath, he put his hand on the doorknob. Peter pressed the doorknob, and the cabin door opened with a prolonged creak. Inside it was dim, and the air was heavy with the smell of mustiness and something else, something he couldn't identify. "Careful," Jack whispered, entering behind Peter. The beam of their flashlights moved across the interior, revealing dusty furniture and shelves full of old books and strange objects. Peter approached the desk, standing under the window. It was covered with a layer of dust, but something on it caught his attention, an old leather-bound journal. He opened it with trembling hands. "It's Anna's journal," he said in disbelief, flipping through the yellowed pages. "The last entry is from the day she disappeared. Jack came closer, looking over Peter's shoulder. What does it say? Peter began to read aloud. June 20th, 1989. Something is wrong with the forest. I hear voices. I see shadows where there shouldn't be any. No one believes me. But I know something is lurking between the trees, something ancient and powerful. I'm scared, but I have to investigate it. If I don't come back, please, don't look for me. Some secrets should remain hidden. Peter felt a chill run down his spine. She knew, he whispered. She knew there was something in the forest. Suddenly, they heard a noise coming from outside. Both men turned abruptly. Felix was standing in the doorway, his eyes glowing in the semi-darkness. Examining the medallion, Peter shook his head. I don't know, but I feel it's important. When he touched the amulet, he felt a strange tingling in his fingers. For a split second, it seemed to him that he saw the forest, not as it was now, but ancient, full of powerful, primeval trees and strange, glowing creatures. The vision disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Peter disoriented and slightly dazed. Are you all right? Jack asked, concerned. Peter nodded, not sure what he had just seen. Yes, this place is affecting me strangely. Felix meowed again, this time louder and more insistently. The cat looked at them as if he wanted them to follow him. Do you think we should follow him? Peter asked. Jack hesitated. It's just a cat, Pete. You don't really think he's trying to tell us something, do you? But Peter felt that Felix wasn't behaving normally. There was something conscious about him, as if he knew more than an ordinary cat should. Let's go, Peter decided. What harm can it do? They left the cabin, following Felix, who led them deeper into the forest. The further they went, the denser the forest became, and the air seemed heavier, pulsating with a strange energy. Suddenly, Felix stopped in front of an enormous, ancient tree. Its trunk was thick and twisted, and its branches reached high into the sky. There was something majestic and disturbing about it at the same time. Peter approached, feeling his heart beating faster and faster. He reached out and touched the tree's bark. At that moment, he felt as if something was pulling him in. The world around him began to spin, and in his ears, he heard the rustle of thousands of voices. He saw images, fragments of the forest's history, ancient rituals, people disappearing between the trees. And everywhere there was her. Anna. Her face appeared and disappeared, and her voice whispered words he couldn't understand. Peter felt his knees giving way beneath him. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was Anna's face, sad and full of fear, but also determined. When he came to, he was lying on the ground, with a worried Jack and Felix leaning over him. What happened? Peter asked in a weak voice. Jack shook his head. You lost consciousness for a few minutes. What happened? What did you see? Peter sat up slowly, his head still pulsing from the flood of images and sounds. Jack, he said quietly, I think I know what happened to Anna, and I'm afraid this is just the beginning. Felix meowed softly, as if confirming his words. The forest around them seemed to breathe, pulsate with life and something else, something that was waiting to be discovered. Peter knew there was no turning back now. The mystery of Anna and the forest had become his mystery, and he felt that discovering the truth might cost him more than he was willing to pay. Peter sat in his living room, staring at the amulet found in the cabin. Jack was pacing nervously around the room, while Felix lay on the windowsill, observing the forest outside. We need to think about this logically, Jack said, stopping in front of Peter. What exactly did you see when you touched that tree? Peter sighed, trying to organize the chaotic images in his head. I saw the history of the forest, and Anna, is part of all this, but I don't understand how. Suddenly, Felix jumped off the windowsill and ran to the door, meowing loudly. A moment later, there was a knock. Peter and Jack exchanged worried glances. They weren't expecting anyone at this hour. Opening the door, Peter came face to face with an elderly woman. Her grey hair was gathered in a tight bun, and her eyes looked at him penetratingly. "Mr. Coleman," she asked quietly. "My name is Helen Williams. I was Anna's friend." Peter felt his heart leap into his throat. "Please, come in," he said, opening the door wider. Helen sat in an armchair, and her gaze fell on the amulet lying on the table. "I see you've already found it," she said with a sigh. "Do you know what this is?" Peter asked, surprised. Helen nodded. "It's the key to everything. Anna, she discovered something in this forest, something ancient and powerful." Jack snorted in disbelief. "You're not suggesting that something supernatural is happening in this forest, are you?" Helen looked at him seriously. "Young man, there are things in this world that science still can't explain. Ravenswood hides a secret older than our civilization." Peter felt a chill run down his spine. "What did Anna discover?" Helen closed her eyes, as if trying to gather her thoughts. "Anna was always sensitive to other dimensions of reality. When she came here to study local folklore, she immediately sensed that something was wrong with the forest. She started digging deeper, looking for old legends, talking to locals." "And what did she find?" Peter asked. Leaning forward, "She discovered that Ravenswood is a portal, a place where the boundary between our world and another dimension is thin. For centuries, guardians protected this place, ensuring that nothing crossed over from the other side. Anna, she became one of them." Jack shook his head. "This sounds like science fiction. You can't expect us to believe this." But Peter felt it was true. Everything he had seen and experienced suddenly made sense. "What happened to Anna?" he asked quietly. Helen sighed heavily. "I don't know exactly. On the night of her disappearance, something broke through the portal. Anna went to stop it. She didn't come back." Suddenly, Felix started hissing, his fur standing on end. Everyone looked towards the window. Outside, between the trees, Peter saw a moving shadow, something that didn't resemble any animal he knew. "It knows we're here," Helen whispered. "It knows you've discovered the truth." Peter felt fear constricting his throat. "What now?" Helen looked at him seriously. "Now you have to make a decision, Peter. Anna chose you as her successor. This amulet, it only responds to those who have the potential to be guardians. You can leave, forget about all this. Or you can accept the role of guardian and protect the world from what lurks on the other side." Peter looked at the amulet, then at Felix, who was staring at him intensely. He felt the weight of responsibility falling on his shoulders. "What if I'm not ready?" he asked quietly. Helen smiled sadly. "No one is ever ready. But sometimes, we are the only ones who can do something." Suddenly, the lights in the house flickered, and a deep rumble came from the forest. Felix bristled and started meowing warningly. "It's coming closer," Helen said, standing up. "You have to make a decision, Peter. And quickly." Peter felt adrenaline filling his body. He knew he was standing on the edge, that his decision would change everything. He looked at Jack, who looked terrified but determined. "Whatever you decide," Jack said, "I'm with you." Peter took a deep breath and reached for the amulet. The moment his fingers touched the cold metal, he felt a wave of energy flowing through his body. The forest behind the window seemed to come alive, trees moving though there was no wind. The shadows between them thickened, forming into shapes that Peter's mind couldn't comprehend. He knew there was no turning back. The mystery of Ravenswood had become his mystery, and he felt that not only his fate, but the fate of the entire world depended on his decision. As Peter grasped the amulet, he felt as if an electric current had shot through his body. The light in the room flickered violently, then went out completely, plunging everyone into darkness. The only source of light now was the amulet, which emitted a soft, silvery glow. "What's happening?" Jack shouted, trying to orient himself in the darkness. Helen placed her hand on Peter's shoulder. "This is the beginning," she said quietly. "The amulet has recognized you as a guardian. Now you must learn to use its power." Suddenly, a terrifying roar came from the forest, causing the windows to rattle. Felix bristled and hissed towards the door. "We don't have time for learning," Peter said, feeling adrenaline fill his veins. "What should I do?" Helen looked at him seriously. "You must trust the amulet. It will show you the way. But remember, its power comes from you, from your will and determination. Peter nodded, gripping the amulet tighter. He felt his mind filling with images and knowledge whose source he couldn't determine. He now knew what he had to do. "We need to go to the forest," he said firmly. "To that old tree." Jack shook his head. "Are you crazy? It's dangerous out there." But Peter was already heading towards the door, with Felix following him. Helen and Jack exchanged glances and also followed them. The forest seemed to have a life of its own. The trees moved, though there was no wind, and the shadows between them seemed to thicken and form into incomprehensible shapes. Peter felt the amulet pulsing in his hand, leading him deeper into the thicket. Suddenly, a huge black figure rose up before them. It didn't resemble any known animal. It was like a living shadow, with eyes burning with a red glow. "What is that?" Jack whispered in terror. "It's a shadow," Helen replied, "a creature from the other side of the portal." The shadow moved towards them, emitting a low, vibrating sound. Peter felt fear constricting his throat. But he knew he had to act. He raised the amulet, which burst into bright light. The shadow recoiled, hissing in pain. Peter felt a surge of courage. "You don't belong in this world," he said loudly, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "Go back to where you came from." The amulet shone even brighter, and the shadow began to shrink and disintegrate. With a final, terrifying howl, it disappeared completely. Peter took a deep breath, feeling both exhausted and full of energy. "Is it over?" he asked, looking at Helen. The older woman shook her head. "This is just the beginning. The shadows have sensed that the portal is unguarded. They will try to break through into our world." Suddenly, Felix started meowing loudly, looking deep into the forest. Everyone turned in that direction and saw a female figure standing between the trees. She was semi-transparent, as if woven from moonlight. "Anna," Helen whispered in disbelief. The figure nodded and began to move away, as if she wanted them to follow her. "We have to follow her," Peter said, moving forward. Jack grabbed his arm. "Wait, how do you know it's not a trap?" Peter looked at his friend. "I don't know, but I feel we have to follow her. It's the only way to learn the whole truth." The group set off after Anna's ghostly figure, venturing deeper into the forest. The trees around them seemed to whisper, and the air was thick with unspoken magic. Finally, they reached the enormous old oak tree, the same one where Peter had his vision. Anna stopped in front of it and turned to face the group. "Peter," her voice sounded like a distant whisper, "you found the amulet. Now you must finish what I started." "What do I have to do?" Peter asked, feeling his heart beating faster and faster. Anna pointed at the tree. "The portal must be closed, but it requires sacrifice. I gave my life to secure it, but it wasn't enough. We need someone who will voluntarily bind their soul to the forest." Peter felt fear constricting his throat. "What does that mean?" "It means you'll become part of the forest," Helen answered quietly. "You'll live, but you won't be able to leave this place. You'll become an eternal guardian." Jack shook his head. "You can't do this, Pete. It's madness." But Peter felt he had no choice. Felix, who was looking with what understanding in his feline eyes. "If I don't do this, what will happen?" Looking at Anna. "The shadows will continue to seep into our world," she replied. "Over time, they'll become stronger until they eventually consume everything." Peter took a deep companions. Helen nodded with his head under. Jack looked terrified but also full of admiration. Felix approached him and rubbed against his legs, as if wanting to give him courage. "I'll do it," Peter finally said, feeling the weight of this decision fall on his shoulders. Anna smiled sadly. "Thank you," she whispered before her figure began to fade. Peter approached the tree, feeling the amulet pulsing in his hand. He knew that in a moment, his life would change forever. But he also knew it was the only way to protect the world from the darkness lurking on the other side of the portal. He placed his hand on the tree's bark and closed his eyes, allowing the power of the amulet to flow through him. He felt his consciousness expanding, encompassing the entire forest. He became one with the trees, with the earth, with the very essence of this place. The last thing he heard before his human consciousness dissolved into the forest was Helen's quiet whisper, "Welcome home, guardian of Raven's Wood." A year had passed since the day Peter Coleman became the guardian of Raven's Wood. To the outside world, Peter had simply disappeared, another mysterious story associated with the cursed forest. But for those who knew the truth, life was never the same again. Jack Lawrence sat on the porch of Peter's house, staring into the forest. The house, according to Peter's wish, had now become a kind of base for new guardians, people who had decided to dedicate their lives to protecting the boundary between worlds. Helen Williams came out of the house, carrying 2 cups of steaming tea. "Thinking again?" she asked, handing one to Jack. Jack sighed, accepting the drink. "It's hard not to think about all this. Sometimes I wonder if it's not just some crazy dream." Helen smiled sadly. "Believe me, sometimes I hope so too, but what we're doing is too important to escape into such thoughts." Suddenly, Felix, who had been dozing on the windowsill, raised his head and meowed softly. A moment later, a young woman emerged from the forest, Maria, one of the new guardians. "Something's happening," she said, approaching the porch. The forest is calling us." Jack and Helen exchanged glances. They quickly stood up and followed Maria into the depths of the forest. Felix followed them, moving gracefully between roots and stones. When they reached the great oak where Peter had made his transformation a year ago, they felt a change in the air. It was thick with magic, and the leaves of the trees rustled even though there was no wind. Suddenly, Peter's figure materialized before them, semi-transparent, woven from the light and shadows of the forest. His eyes, once brown, now shimmered with all shades of green. "Welcome, friends," he said in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere. "I have important news." Helen stepped forward. "What's happening is Peter?" "The portal is destabilizing again," the Guardian replied. "The shadows are growing stronger. We need more Guardians." Jack felt his heart leap into his throat. "But your sacrifice was supposed to stop this. How is it possible that it's happening again?" Peter sighed, and with him, all the trees in the forest rustled. "The balance between worlds is delicate. My presence helps, but it's not enough. We need more people willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good." Maria looked at him with determination. "What should we do?" "You must find more people like you," Peter replied, "people with pure hearts and strong will. Only they can become guardians." Helen nodded. "We'll do our best, but Peter, how do you feel? Are you happy?" Peter's figure flickered, and a strange expression appeared on his face, a mixture of sadness and deep peace. "Happiness is a complicated concept, Helen. I'm no longer human, not in the traditional sense of the word, but I feel fulfilled. I know my sacrifice has meaning." Jack felt tears welling up in his eyes. "We miss you, Pete." Is there a chance you'll ever come back?" Peter smiled sadly. "I'm here, Jack, always, in every tree, in every leaf. I can't return to my human form, but I'm more present than ever." Suddenly Felix approached Peter's figure and rubbed against his legs, or rather, where his legs should be. To everyone's amazement, the cat seemed to really touch the ghostly figure. "Ah, Felix," Peter laughed, and his laughter sounded like the whisper of wind in the treetops. "You always knew more than you let on, didn't you?" The cat meowed in response, looking at his former master with a mixture of devotion and understanding. "Felix will be your guide," Peter said. "He will sense potential guardians. Trust him." Helen nodded. "I always knew this cat was special." Peter looked at each of them in turn. "Remember that although the task before you is difficult, you are not alone. I will always be here, ready to help. Now go." "The shadows are growing in strength. We have no time to lose." As Peter's figure began to fade, Jack felt a sudden surge of determination. "We won't let you down, Pete," he said firmly. "I promise." Peter smiled one last time before completely disappearing. But even when his figure vanished, the Guardians could feel his presence, in the rustle of leaves, in the smell of the forest, in the warmth of the sun's rays breaking through the treetops. As they returned to the house, Jack felt a mixture of sadness and hope. He knew a difficult task awaited them, But he also knew that as long as Raven's Wood stood and Peter watched over it, there was hope for the world. Felix led the group, his tail held high as if pointing the way, and despite all the dangers that awaited them, Jack felt they were ready to face them, because now they were more than just a group of random people. They were guardians, defenders of the boundary between worlds, and with Peter by their side, even if not in human form, they were invincible. 5 years had passed since the day Peter Coleman became the guardian of Raven's Wood. Much had changed during this time. The house on the edge of the forest, once Peter's solitary haven, now bustled with life. It had become the operational center for a growing group of guardians, people ready to sacrifice everything to protect the boundary between worlds. Jack Lawrence, once a skeptical detective, was now a pillar of the Guardian community. His analytical mind and investigative skills proved invaluable in recruiting new members and solving problems that their mission brought. Helen Williams, despite her advanced age, remained a source of wisdom and knowledge for the younger Guardians. Her familiarity with old legends and rituals had saved them countless times in difficult situations. Maria, once a novice, was now one of the most trusted Guardians. Her intuition and ability to sense threats had saved them countless times. And Felix, Peter's cat, had become a living legend among the Guardians. His extraordinary ability to sense potential guardians and threats had made him an indispensable member of the team. That evening, everyone gathered in the living room. The atmosphere was tense. The last few days had brought disturbing news. The shadows were growing stronger, and the portal between worlds was becoming increasingly unstable. "We have to do something," Maria said, pacing nervously around the room. "We can't let the shadows break through into our world." Helen nodded. "I agree. But what can we do?" Peter gave everything to secure the portal. Jack, who had been silent until now, spoke quietly. "Maybe it's time we asked Peter for a final solution." Everyone looked at him in disbelief. "What do you mean?" Helen asked. Jack sighed heavily. "Peter became part of the forest, right? What if he could use that connection to close the portal forever?" A heavy silence fell. Everyone knew what this meant. Peter would have to sacrifice the remnant of his human consciousness, completely merging with the forest. Suddenly, Felix, who had been dozing on the windowsill, jumped down and ran to the door. He meowed loudly, scratching at the wood. "I think he wants us to follow him," Maria said, opening the door. The group set off after the cat into the depths of the forest. The night was dark, but Felix led them surely, his eyes shining in the darkness like lanterns. When they reached the great oak, the heart of Raven's Wood, they felt a change in the air. It was thick with magic, and shadows seemed to dance around them. Suddenly, Peter's figure materialized before them. He looked different than usual, more solid, more human. "Welcome, friends," he said, in a voice that sounded like the rustle of wind in the treetops. "I know why you've come." Jack stepped forward. "Pete, is it true? Can you close the portal forever?" Peter nodded. "Yes, I can, but the price will be high. I'll lose the remnant of my human consciousness. I'll become the forest, completely and irreversibly." Helen felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Is there no other way?" "Unfortunately not," Peter replied. "But don't be sad, Helen. This is my choice, my destiny." Maria looked at him with admiration and sadness. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Peter smiled gently. "I want to protect this world. This is my purpose, my calling. I'm ready." Jack felt his heart constrict with pain. "We'll miss you." "Pete, I'm not going anywhere," Peter replied. "I'll be in every tree, in every leaf, in every breath of wind. I'll always be with you." Felix approached Peter and rubbed against his legs. Peter bent down and stroked the cat's head. "Take care of them, my faithful friend," he whispered. Then Peter looked at each of them in turn. "You are the best guardians I could have asked for. I'm proud of you. And now, it's time." Peter turned and approached the great oak. He placed his hand on it and closed his eyes. The air around them swirled, filling with light and shadow. The guardians watched with a mixture of fear and awe as Peter's figure began to blur, merging with the tree. The forest around them came alive. Every tree, every bush, every blade of grass seemed to pulse with energy. Suddenly, everything stopped. The forest fell silent, but it was a silence full of life and power. The Guardians felt that something had changed. The air was lighter, cleaner. The shadows that had always lurked at the edge of their consciousness were gone. Helen was the first to break the silence. "He did it," she whispered. "The portal is closed." Jack nodded, unable to hold back tears. "Yes, Peter sacrificed himself for all of us." Maria looked around. "Do you feel that? The forest. It's alive, more than ever." Felix meowed softly, rubbing against the legs of each of the Guardians as if wanting to comfort them. "What now?" Maria asked. Jack straightened up, wiping away tears. Now we continue our mission. Peter gave us a chance. Safety. We can't waste it." Helen nodded. "You're right. We need to find more Guardians, teach them, prepare them for the future. Because although this portal is closed," Maria added, "who knows what other threats await the world?" As they returned home, the forest rustled around them. In that rustle, they heard the echo of Peter's voice, his laughter, his words of encouragement. They knew that although their friend had departed in his human form, he had never really left them. Felix led the group, his tail held high, and when they reached the house on the edge of the forest, the first rays of the rising sun illuminated the sky. It was a new day, a new beginning. And although the road ahead of them was uncertain, the Guardians knew one thing. As long as the forest stands, as long as they remember Peter's sacrifice, there will always be hope. Because in the darkest night, there is always room for light. And Ravenswood, thanks to Peter, had become a beacon of that light, protecting the world from darkness. Dear readers, we invite you to continue this journey with us. Like the Guardians of Ravenswood, you too can become part of something greater. We've prepared a special playlist with equally fascinating stories that explore the mysteries of the supernatural and the power of nature. You can find it by clicking the link on the left side. If this story has touched your hearts, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. We bring unique stories every day that explore the complexities of life and the mysteries surrounding us. Don't miss our upcoming content. And remember, just like Peter and his friends, each of us has the power to make a change. How about sharing in the comments a situation where you felt a special connection with nature? Or maybe a moment when you sacrificed yourself for something greater than yourself. Together, we can continue the story of the Guardians of Ravenswood in our own lives, protecting and appreciating the natural world around us. Until the next story, readers. And remember, magic is everywhere. You just need to know where to look.